All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm delighted to introduce this amazing panel today, so let's dive right in. I'm going to introduce folks from your left to right. So furthest away from me is Lucy Thompson. She is an attorney and principal at Livingston, a law firm, and she's from Washington, D.C., and also the chair of the American Bar Association's AI Task Force. Next, in the middle, we have Adam Isles. Adam is the principal and the head of cybersecurity at the prestigious Chertoff Group in Washington, D.C. Closest to me, we have Natalie Pierce. She's a partner at the law firm of Gunderson here in Silicon Valley. She also chairs their employment practice and was a California AI Lawyer of the Year. And I'm Patrick Houston, your moderator. I'm a retired Army general and a member of the FBI's AI Task Force. So I want to quickly set the stage for our discussion. You all know this world can be a dangerous and unpredictable place. You see the media reports. We have war in Gaza and the Ukraine. We have Iran sending hundreds of missiles and drones into Israel. ISIS terrorists claimed responsibility for a terrorist attack on a theater in Moscow recently. There's economic tension between the United States and China, the TikTok Cold War, and of course, you have daily cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns out there. Now, against this backdrop, there is a global AI arms race underway. President Xi said that China plans to be the world's premier AI innovation center by 2030. That's only 5.5 years away. And when it comes to the risk of war with China, I'm actually fairly optimistic. Our economic interdependence creates inherent stability. Now, in Russia, President Putin had similar comments. He said that whoever leads in AI will rule the world. And although Russia does not have the same economic resources as China or even the US, they do have the war in Ukraine as a test bed for autonomous systems, AI systems, including autonomous weapons. Now, in my book, Russia is a bit of a wild card. Putin is under pressure, economically, diplomatically, politically, and this makes him a bit desperate and unpredictable. Now, to be fair, here in the United States, President Biden's approach to AI has been pretty similar. He said that the US must lead in AI for the sake of security, the economy, and society. So there's clearly a global AI arms race underway, and it's only accelerated with the introduction of generative AI. So with this cheery backdrop, I want to turn to our panelists here and ask each of them, what keeps you up at night? What concerns do you have? And I'd like to start on the far end, Lucy, and just work our way this way.
So in my work over the last year, deepfakes is the key seismic problem that we have to deal with. And this can actually upend the way we handle litigation and evidence in court. And this is what judges call the liar's dividend, because as we all know, evidence can be fraudulently created, changed. In fact, the newest applications on our smartphones say we can change photographs, take people out of the pictures, change the background. So the liar's dividend is people can say that legitimate evidence in court is false or a deepfake, or deepfakes can be introduced in evidence, and no one will know whether it's true or not. So under the federal rules of evidence, judges and lawyers have a huge challenge. So we'll talk about that some more later.
For me, it's digital identity subversion. And maybe I can frame up some context around that. As you look at the way our economy is evolving, we're in this massive shift towards digital, a mobile economy, whether we're talking about payments, hiring, contracts. You think from a payments perspective about the fact that over the space of 4 years, the volume of Zelle payments has gone from $20 billion to $120 billion. The amount of venture funding for fintech firms, right, up from $7 billion to $60 billion over the space of 4 years. You look in an employment context at what COVID has done for the shift from, and maybe we're seeing a little bit of step back from this, but the shift from remote work first employment, tripling over the course of 2 years. DHS issued a rule last August that made remote employment eligibility verification now permanent under certain conditions. All of that depends on trusted identity as a foundation to that ecosystem. And the bad guys have figured this out. And so the AI context around this, when we talk about AI risk generally, we put it into 3 buckets. Bucket 1 is the use of AI as an instrumentality of a bad act. Essentially the weaponization of AI by a threat actor against someone else. Bucket 2 is the subversion of AI itself, an attack on AI. And bucket 3 is unintended consequences around the legitimate use of AI. And digital identity checks all 3 of those boxes, right? We're seeing, to Lucy's point around deepfakes, that being used to subvert digital identity. We're seeing attacks, as we start to use AI to improve the security of these systems, of attacks focused on how do I understand the blind spots in those systems. And ultimately, as digital identity becomes more AI dependent, from an unintended consequences point of view, there's going to be a fundamental question around kind of who's the referee. That wasn't me, or I was somehow denied a benefit. Who's the referee? So the question is, how do we strike the balance behind the drivers in our economy for seamless experiences, no friction, with a security imperative around resiliency and a continuous cycle of anticipating, withstanding, evolving from adaptive threat behavior?
And for me, it's election interference, particularly through use of deepfakes. Right now, it's all over the news what's happening in India. We have the largest democratic event playing out. We have nearly 1 billion voters, 800 million who have devices, who are heavy users of WhatsApp and YouTube. And the misinformation and disinformation campaigns are rampant. We've seen arrests made. We've seen deepfakes of Bollywood actors who traditionally don't weigh in to voice their support for candidates have been depicted as saying negative things about Prime Minister Modi. There's also deepfake videos of his aides saying things they have never said. And I think that's just a precursor for what we can expect to see with our own upcoming elections.
Thanks. And for me, it's killer robots. Now, not necessarily those that are being used responsibly and legally, but with autonomous weapons, there is tremendous room for error by those who are irresponsible, terrorists and others out there. We're going to dig into all these topics a little bit more, and then hopefully we will share some solutions with you to the problems we're raising. And then I also want to make sure that we get time to talk about the ABA's AI task force. Lucy can share some updates with us on that. So for now, I will just say, Lucy and Natalie, you both mentioned deepfakes. Natalie, can you share some examples of these with our audience?
Yeah, so deepfakes are the hyper-realistic manipulation of audio and video. And the way that developers of deepfakes do this is by using deep machine learning and training generative adversarial networks. And what that means is that you have one neural network that is working to generate the deepfake and another that's working to detect the deepfake. And that's why over time they're becoming so difficult for humans to really see or hear the difference. So let's start with an audio example first.
Hello, I'm not Johnny Cash. I'm a Barbie girl in a Barbie world. Life in plastic, it's fantastic. You can brush my hair, undress me everywhere. Oh, come on Barbie, let's go party, 'cause I'm in a Barbie world.
So I think we all know Johnny Cash did not sing Barbie Girl, but my goodness, doesn't it sound like him? His voice is so very distinctive, and so you can imagine why grandparents and executives are falling, grandparents are being targeted with voices of their grandchildren sounding like they're in distress, and they're making payments just to help their grandchildren. Executives who have wired money to, and we've mainly seen it in audio, but now what's happening with video, and this video that we'll show, it's from a while ago, but it's becoming even more difficult to detect. So let's go ahead and show this one.
I am not Morgan Freeman, and what you see is not real. Well, at least in contemporary terms, it is not. What if I were to tell you that I am not even a human being? Would you believe me? What is your perception of reality? Is it the ability to capture, process, and make sense of the information our senses receive? If you can see, hear, taste, or smell something, does that make it real? Or is it simply the ability to feel? I would like to welcome you to the era of synthetic reality. Now, what do you see?
So recently in the news, you may have heard about a financial worker who was sitting in Hong Kong and received a call purportedly from the CFO sitting in the UK saying that he needed assistance with a secretive financial transaction. And the worker was, of course, skeptical. But once he got on a Zoom call with a number of his colleagues, who were not at all his colleagues, they were all deep fakes of his colleagues, he went ahead and made 15 separate transactions, wiring money into different accounts in Hong Kong to the tune of $25 million. Because if a photo's worth 1,000 words, you can imagine people seeing video and it's worth 1 million words. So the need to really increase awareness around these technologies. And then this next example, it's not publicly, it's not publicly available yet, but we expect it to come out in the next few months. And this is examples of text to video. Now, the opportunities from using these basic prompts to generate these videos, you can think of how they can be used for educational purposes, for entertainment purposes, just for creative outlets. But I think OpenAI, the creator of Sora, is very well aware of how these could be used for disinformation campaigns or deep fakes, and is absolutely putting safety measures into place. But it's pretty astounding what can be done with pretty straightforward.
So Natalie, you just type in the text and it creates these videos?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, you should be seeing the prompts.
Thanks, Natalie. That makes me want to circle back to Lucy. And she talked about deepfakes in the courtroom and what some of the courts and lawyers are doing about that out there. Lucy, you want to elaborate on this a little bit for us?
Well, yes, we're going to consider what's the impact of these deepfakes on the rule of law. So, out of curiosity, how many people in this room are lawyers? So a few of them, and so I assume the rest of you are cyber professionals and corporate executives. So at the American Bar Association, we are assessing the impact of AI on the rule of law. And in the courtroom, where the judges are really the guardians of the rule of law, the judges are presented with a huge problem. And why is this a problem? Well, the federal rules of evidence govern the admissibility of evidence, and juries tend to decide criminal cases and other cases. So juries who aren't educated in tech are going to be presented with these deep fakes. So a judge will consider the admissibility of a piece of evidence, and the judge looks at what the party offering the evidence says about it, then considers any opposition, and then decides whether there's a culpable likelihood that the evidence is accurate. And that's a very low bar under the federal rules of evidence. So most of the evidence traditionally will come in as evidence, and then juries will assess it in connection with the case. So what is a jury to do with this? And why is this a problem? Well, research shows that people tend to believe what they see and hear. So even if there's testimony by experts that a piece of evidence is a deep fake, a juror is generally not going to consider that as strongly as what their impressions are with these pieces of evidence that you just saw. So the judges are very concerned about this problem. Many of them said, oh, we know how to handle this, it's not a problem. But a group of judges on the AI task force are working on writing articles, doing speeches, trying to educate people about how this may upend litigation as we know it. So Patrick said, well, we need to assess solutions here if there are any. So some of the experts, one judge, Paul Grimm, is an expert on admissibility, and Professor Maura Grossman have presented a few approaches to the federal judges group, and those are some of them on this slide. One of them is to make a small change in the rule of evidence to say that evidence must be reliable rather than accurate, because evidence, a deep fake, could be accurate but not reliable. And then there's some other suggestions. One is that judges can exclude evidence that can be extremely prejudicial. So that's one tool that judges have. And then another one is to treat evidence that could be a deep fake like scientific evidence under this case called Daubert, where evidence has to be assessed by scientists or technology experts before it's admitted. Unfortunately, the judges group that considers the rules of evidence have said, well, this is all very nice, but we really don't need these changes. So further discussion is going to be forthcoming. And then California passed a law that said that judges need to screen for deepfakes. But the question is, how is that going to be done, and who's going to do it? And finally, industry groups are working on watermarking techniques, and Mark Warner, who was here yesterday, was talking about Congress needing to push for watermarking technologies. But as you all know, as cyber professionals, these watermarks can be easily removed. So at the present time, judges and lawyers have to confront the fact that there's no solution to this problem, and litigation is going to go forward, and it remains to be seen what happens next.
And Natalie said that a picture's worth 1,000 words and a video worth 1,000,000. I think that can be truer in no place more so than with a jury. So that's incredible. Adam, you talked about digital identification, subversion as the thing that keeps you up at night. Can you share some more thoughts, dig into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. So maybe to frame this up, let's talk about what the identity lifecycle looks like. And so when we do that, we go to authoritative guidance. And so what's authoritative in this context? NIST, which is the national standards body for the United States. So NIST special publication 800-63, and their sub-publications describes that life cycle. And it starts with, at the initial stage, enrollment and identity proofing, which is to say we have a new applicant, a new hire, someone that's looking to do a transaction with us, a benefit. This is the first time we're seeing this person. How do we establish trust in that identity? We go on to authentication, there's a federation piece. And so if we just take identity enrollment and proofing for a moment, this describes 3 basic steps, right? There's an identity resolution process, which is, okay, is this actually a unique identity? And this is actually where a social security number, which isn't intended this way, is useful, right? It's a pretty unique attribute, for anyone that's in the United States. The second piece is validation, which is to say, okay, what evidence do you have that establishes you are who you say you are? Driver's licenses, passports, things of that nature. And how do we establish its accuracy and whether it's still valid and it's connected to you? The third piece is verification, which is, okay, the evidence is valid, but is it associated with you? And all 3 of those things need to be in place for identity to be trusted. What we've seen for years is the bad guys working to subvert this life cycle just in the identity enrollment and proofing context. There's a whole separate conversation around authentication, which we'll spend a little bit of time in a moment. So if you look at FinCEN reporting, FinCEN is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the Department of the Treasury. They'll tell you that when they look at the suspicious activity reports that banks are required to file, just for the year 2021, the dollar amount associated with suspicious activity reports around kind of suspicious evidence, which is that passport a real passport? Is that driver's license a real passport? Amounted to over $200 billion in suspicious activity. They'll also tell you that suspicious validation, which is, okay, is that document associated with that person? Another 40 million. And when they look at suspicious authentication, now we're up to more than $100 billion just in 2021 alone. Over $350 billion in suspicious activity associated with the identity life cycle. So then we move from payments to employment. And so who do we think about when we think about the most sanctioned countries in the world right now? Iran, North Korea. Well, surely North Koreans couldn't get hired to do work in this country. Think again. You look at a series of seizure warrants that have been unsealed over the last year and Treasury Department reporting. You'll see a multi-year conspiracy of North Korean coders getting hired essentially to do freelance software development work. Right? And that's before what Natalie talked about, which is generative adversarial networks. Now, of course, we've seen identity proofing technology mature. We've seen the rollout of remote proofing solutions where we're capturing documents, we're taking selfies, we're comparing the two, and the bad guys are keeping pace with where the technology's headed. And so we've seen in this space a proliferation of both tools and groups. There's one of the providers in this space is a company called iProve, and they produce a threat intelligence report around this. And they talk about the number of groups that are devoted specifically towards face swaps and deep faking. Some of these groups have 100,000 users associated with them, multiple groups. And so then we think, all right, well, these groups are out there, but can they be successful? There was a really interesting report out of 404 published this February that where the reporter basically took advantage of some of this tooling to basically walk through the entire Know Your Customer process, the KYC process for a large online crypto, and passed KYC using deepfake technology or alleged deepfake. Now, is that specific platform still available? Not necessarily, but the underlying technology is there. And so we see this in an identity-proofing context. We've seen this in an authentication context, whereas multi-factor authentication is rolled out. We've seen the use of deepfake audio and the deepfake video to work in the blind spots, either to manipulate people into approving multi-factor authentication or in the context of facial. So another example is in Thailand for high value financial transactions, there's a requirement where if you're doing it remotely, to do a selfie compare, right? And so there's a whole class of malware that's focused around taking control of that phone, capturing the image, and being able to replay it in a subsequent financial transaction. That's not actually, I don't think, a deep fake, but what it talks about is that second bucket of AI risk, which is I'm not so much weaponizing AI as finding blind spots in the AI to take advantage of to do what I'm trying to do. And so the question, as we think about this is, where do we go from here? And if you think about, cybersecurity has been when I started at the Justice Department 26 years ago, the first book I was told to read was a book called The Cuckoo's Egg, about a hacking event in the mid-1980s. It's been around for 40 years. Part of the challenge with cybersecurity has been not just the advancement in the ubiquity of technology, but the consumerization of it. The Netscape browser, AOL accounts, cloud, et cetera. And so I think part of the challenge around AI is not just the tremendous power of it, but its consumerization and its availability to everyone.
Natalie, you talked about election interference, and I think everyone in the audience is aware that this is a US presidential election year. Are your concerns tied to deep fakes, or what else can you share about that?
Yeah, well, again, we're already seeing how this is playing out in India, and it's also played out in the US with the robocall that was in President Biden's voice that went out to New Hampshire primary voters, and and the Washington Post quote, I think is one that we should all pay very close attention to. One thing that we've seen, again, using India, who's in the midst of their election, is personalized deep fakes that are going out over WhatsApp. So using the person's name, very individualized, targeted in a dozen different languages, right? So many different languages are spoken in India. And so most of this is done through social networks. So the social media networks, those who are providing those platforms absolutely are going to have their work cut out for them, and there's a lot of pressure on those teams to really do everything possible to detect when something is a deep fake. The way that India is trying to address it now is to ask the Facebooks or Meta and ask you to take it down while they're doing the investigation. But this is happening so quickly in real time and at such an unprecedented scale that we're seeing how difficult it is. And I don't think there's anybody who doubts that we're not going to see a lot of deep fakes out there in connection with our election this year.
Thanks, Natalie. I mentioned my concern over killer robots. I want to show a short video. It's a trailer from a Netflix show that I think highlights the issue quite well.
AI is a dual-edged sword. At the flip of a switch, the technology becomes lethal.
There is no place that is ground zero for this conversation more than military applications.
Forces that are supported by AI will absolutely crush and destroy forces without.
Militaries are racing to develop AI faster than their adversaries.
The AI, unless it's told to fear death, will not fear death.
There is no second place in war. If you're going up against an AI pilot, you don't stand a chance.
How would a robot know the difference between what's legal and what is right?
The hairs on the back of my neck literally stood up on end. The computer made tens of thousands of ideas for new chemical weapons.
Will we cede the decision to take a life to algorithms, to computer software? It's one of the most pressing issues of our time. And if not used wisely, poses a grave risk to every single person on the planet.
Okay, I want to reiterate that my concern over killer robots is primarily about those who would use them illegally or irresponsibly. I am overall an AI optimist, and I actually think that autonomous systems, including autonomous weapons, can make something like war that is inherently inhumane less inhumane if used properly. War is filled with chaos and confusion and death and destruction, and all that is perfectly legal. But it's also filled with tragedy, misidentification, civilian casualties, and I think that these autonomous systems that can improve situational awareness under these circumstances can actually help, again, make it less inhumane. And I'm mostly concerned because we've heard about the ubiquitousness of this wide availability to anyone who wants to use these technologies out there. It's spreading so quickly that those who are terrorists and others who would use this irresponsibly, that's the part that concerns me most about this. Okay, we've discussed concerns, a lot of concerns, and as I promised you, we want to share a few solutions to these things. This is a list of solutions. You have these materials. There are links in there to a lot of different papers and great resources to find solutions to the problems that we have addressed out there. Again, we've talked most about deep fakes, and so I want to see if there's any guidance, official guidance out there, Adam, that you're willing to share with us with regard to deep fakes.
So last fall, the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, the FBI, and DoD jointly released a set of, guidance on deepfakes that both describes the threat and describes a series of recommendations, both to deal with generally, how to detect and deal with deepfakes, but also more specifically for high-profile individuals within an organization, be it a political leader or a company executive, steps that what can take to try and mitigate deepfake risk to those identities. That guidance talks about things both like liveness detection to detect mischief in identity verification, as well as looking for other signals like metadata in a phone to try and detect deepfakes. But what I would say is that the other shoe in this area that has yet to drop that I think will be really important is NIST. And so I talked earlier about NIST 800-63, which is the authoritative guidance around the digital identity landscape. And so we're waiting for version 4 of that guidance to be released, and that will have updated guidance on mitigations to deal with fraud, as well as to think about new technologies that are just coming onto line. And so, what's an example of that? We started to see, and for those of you from states like Arizona, you already have access to mobile driver's licenses. And so as we start to think about the ability to take an authoritative identity enrollment verification process and then give that in a way that has federation associated with it, which is to say now I not only have the proofing, but I can attach it. We're almost creating like the Visa or the MasterCard of identity in that context. And so I think it'll be really interesting to watch that technology come out. And one of the challenges right now with things like social security numbers is that there really isn't a way of verifying a social security number. We kind of rely on credit bureaus for inherited verification. So the opportunity to deal with, validation is, I think, a really important question. The issue with all of this stuff is adoption. And the guidance can be out there, the technology can be out there, but is anyone actually going to use it? And so the real question is around incentivization. And how do we use, whether it's regulation, if it's not regulation, at some point, this is lawyers group, it's going to be litigation, or I think insurance is an interesting angle to think about as well. My observation for incentivization is that part of what makes incentivization work is choice. And so starting by not using a stick, but using a carrot. And so how many people flew here to get to RSA? Raise your hand if you flew here. Okay. How many people have enrolled in PreCheck? Right, so you're seeing the benefit, right, out of surrendering additional forms of identity for a benefit. And that element of choice, you don't have to enroll in PreCheck, but it's there for you, I think is a critical enabler for adoption.
Thanks. Lucy, this session's part of the legal track, and I'm going to circle back to you again in your role as the chair of the AI task force for the Lawyers Association of America. What can you share with us about what the AI task force has been doing and finding out there, in addition to what you've already shared?
Well, the AI task force was established last summer by Mary Smith, who's the president of the American Bar Association. And she's actually a computer scientist and a very tech-savvy lawyer. So she decided that the two most important issues of the day were AI and the impact on the legal profession, and as Natalie was talking about, election interference. So she has two task forces, one on AI and the other one on elections, saving democracy. The Democracy Task Force is headed by Jay Johnson, former Secretary of DHS, and Judge Michael Luttig, who's been on many news shows talking about these problems that we all need to deal with between now and November. So the AI task force consists of 50 people. Many of them are lawyers, but most of those people are either engineers or computer scientists. So we divided, in order to try to break this down, we divided the work of the group into 7 working groups, focusing on what are the legal issues that come up, like you all are studying what the privacy and security issues are, but behind all that are legal issues. There's gaps in the laws, there's impacts on what developers are doing. So this is a list of all the working groups. We have a very nice website called at ambar.org/AI law. And we've been doing webinars with people who are making policy and assessing some of these issues. All of those webinars and our research is on that website in front of the paywall, so it's available to all of you to check out. Our mandate for AI and risk management is very broad. As a cyber engineer myself, I'm trying to make sure that we take all the research that you all are doing and the insights and bringing them back to the group to analyze so that we can provide legal insights that will be helpful to all of you.
And,
next.
Well, I was going to say that along the lines of what we discussed before about practical solutions, can you share some recommendations or guidelines, or at least the key ones that you think that would be good for lawyers to know?
Yes. So last year, the American Bar Association House of Delegates, which is the policy-making arm of the ABA, was really in the forefront in adopting the guidelines that you see here, the guardrails that apply to developers and people who are working on all of these AI tools. And a lot of the developers and experts like you aren't aware of all the legal theories and legal premises behind some of this work. So one of them is that a human should be in the loop. And that's there's pretty broad consensus on that. Some people are trying to say that patents should be available to computer-generated material, and that's something that the Patent and Trademark Office is looking at, but they've issued policy that says a human has to create material to be patented. And humans should be in the loop at all times. Even when Patrick was talking about war, it's important to have someone at each stage making decisions. And then transparency is another one. And when we get to court, judges expect that whatever evidence is introduced can be explained. And with AI, that's certainly a challenge, and there's some balancing here. But generally, this guardrail says that transparency is very important. And traceability, which is another one. And then accountability. And liability is certainly going to be an issue when things go wrong with AI. And so accountability is something that will be developed through legal cases as we go forward. So we hope you'll check out our work, and we want to know the kinds of work that you're doing that we could integrate into the things that the lawyers are considering.
Thanks, Lucy. Natalie, you've also been heavily involved in helping lawyers leverage AI to do their work. This is a list of the top 10 tips from your article. Is there anything you want to highlight or share from this to kind of piggyback on what Lucy said for us?
Sure. So much of what Lucy said, I think, is in these recommendations, because we're really talking so let me just back up and say I am an employment attorney, as Patrick mentioned, but for the last decade I've been very focused on introduction of transformative technologies into the workforce, and feel very strongly that for our own national security, it's critical that we realize what a skills gap we have and the need to really reskill and upskill individuals. It is so critical. Then in 2022 along comes generative AI, and I think that a lot of us really didn't expect this kind of a transformation this soon, and my goodness, it's happening so quickly. Many say that it's beyond anything that electricity did in terms of bringing changes to our world. And so and for anyone who is interested, I have written quite a bit on this space. If you put in your preferred search engine Natalie Pierce and generative AI, it will pull up a lot of these concepts around the impact on the workplace. But I think that we're in an age of lifelong learning where it really is important that we are transparent, that we're able to explain the tools that we're using, and we know that there will be that accountability, because our regulations are never going to keep up with technology. They really never have. And I think, to Adam's point, it's really going to be the market forces and those incentives that carry the day. But that doesn't mean that our existing laws will not continue to be applied. And so, to Lucy's point, that human oversight is so necessary. We have to see what the output is, and we can't just see answers to the outputs, especially when we don't even understand. And so that we see that playing in very heavily when it comes to things like recruiting of candidates or deciding promotions, so on and so forth. But bringing folks along and having them be part of the conversation, I think, is really, really critical.
Thank you. Our time here is coming to a close. I want to ask each of you in 1 minute or less to share your final thought or tip or recommendation or anything you want with the audience. Start on that end, we'll just work our way down.
So just a couple of quick points. Yesterday, Mark Warner was here talking about his priorities for Congress. And he said we need some guardrails around AI. So that's something that hopefully the lawyers and you all can think about together. I wanted to let you know that for the ABA annual meeting, we'll be releasing a report of the AI task force and also a comprehensive book on AI. addressing legal issues, policy, and practical strategies. And hopefully you'll find that interesting and helpful.
Thank you. Adam?
On digital identity, AI is going to be a huge part of the solution. And I think the risk here is actually in the lack of data. And what I mean by that is the risk is really around data stovepipes and people not sharing. The Treasury Department issued a report earlier this year on AI in the financial sector. And for as much information sharing as we've been doing on cybersecurity, you're not seeing that same level of information sharing on fraud, which is essentially what we're talking about here. So we need to be thinking about what does information sharing look like in this context.
Natalie?
Yeah, I know we're out of time, so I'll just say learn to responsibly embrace generative AI. It's a superpower. It's going to change everything. And now's the time to embrace, become the best prompt engineer you can be.
Great. And I'm going to share my #1 tip for any organization adopting AI, and it is human and machine teaming. We all know there are things that humans do better than machines, and there are things that machines can do better than humans. The key is to integrate them in ways that leverage the respective strengths of each. A lot of people will pitch this as it's either humans or machines. Which way are you going to go on this? And that is a false dichotomy. You can have both, and you can have the best of both, and that's human and machine teaming. So with that, I want to ask that you all join me in thanking this panel for their great work here.